Welcome. We're going to look at the second part of our lesson. The previous part was given out earlier. And what we're talking about is work ethic. Putting God first in our life by our occupation, by the job that we do. In the last lesson, we talked about how Christians should work thoughtfully. In other words, we need to recognize that it's our responsibility to work. God put Adam and Eve in a garden to tend a garden. And so it's important for us to be mindful of having a good work ethic and putting God first. Secondly, we talked about how Christians should work boldly. We should realize that work in many ways defines who we are, and it defines what we do. And so we need to work with all of our might. Thirdly, we talked about how Christians should work thriftfully. It's important for us to budget ourselves, to invest for the future, and to recognize the importance of living within our means. And fourthly, we talked about how Christians should work conscientiously. We're working in a true sense for God and not by man. And in many ways, people will judge our spiritual nature, our religious nature, by the way we act and by the way we work in our occupation. Now, as we continue this lesson, as we continue these things, I want us to see how Christians should work modestly. Now, what I mean by that is we need to recognize that every occupation has value. Whether you collect trash or whether you are the mayor or the governor of the Commonwealth, every job has value. And every person who works has value. Let's look at some passages here. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 23, "In all labor there is profit, but idle chatter leads only to poverty." Proverbs 28:19, "He who tills his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows simple stuff, frivolity, will have poverty enough." You see, as Christians, we need to realize that it's important for us to work. And every job, every occupation is seen in a good light by God. Also, we need to be willing to work with our hands. Many times as we focus on our teenagers growing up and we talk about whether they should go to college or whether they should stay home and find other skills and things such as that, we forget the importance of an ability to work with our own hands, to provide for ourselves no matter what it is that we're doing. That's why many of our college kids go and get a major which doesn't provide for themselves. And that's not God's plan. That's not God's idea. We need to realize that we better be able to work with our hands and provide for ourselves. One of the great examples of this, I think, is Paul the Apostle. In Acts chapter 22 and verse 3, we see where his parents sent him to a very prestigious university. He studied at the feet of Gamaliel, which is one of the highest Judaizing schools that existed in the world at that time. But as was the habit of Jewish people at that day, they also taught every Jewish young man a menial, if you will, occupation, an occupation where they worked with their own hands. And that's why in Acts 18 and verse 3, we see the preacher, the Apostle Paul, also had the talent of mending tents, of building tents, building the fabric to put a tent together. And so what you see here is a man who is very highly educated, but also someone who is a handyman, who is able to work with his hands and provide for himself no matter what. Now, some people say that they're too good for a certain job. And some people look down on people who work certain tasks or whatever else it may be. As Christians, we've got to be modest and realize that every one of us stands in an equal place before God. Think with me, if you will, about David in the Old Testament. Ultimate idea of how someone works up the company ladder. As a young man, he was a shepherd, doing the job of a young boy, watching the sheep of his father. He worked himself up eventually to becoming a musician, even playing before the king. And eventually, David, by the power of God, became king over all the people. Now, when David was king, he drew back from the time in which he was a shepherd. You see that in Psalm 23. And when David was king and writing the Psalms, you see where he reaches back to the time in which he was a musician. and you see the different instruments and different musical things which are listed all through the psalm. It's important for us to realize that all jobs have dignity, have value, and how all of the work in which we do, whether it be more of a mental job that we're doing or more of a physical job we're doing, they contribute to who we are, and they contribute to our value that we provide for society. Secondly, I want us to notice that Christians are to work productively. Sloth, laziness, is the enemy of the Christian. Christians should never be accused of being lazy. In Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 6, the writer says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise." Going a few verses later, looking there at verse 9, "Oh, how long will you slumber, you sluggard? When shall you arise from your sleep?" You see, God's people are called to be active. God's people are called to be productive. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 11, Paul, as he's instructing the Christians about their everyday life, he says, "You better be sure," Romans 12:11, "not to be lagging in diligence, but you need to be fervent in spirit, and you need to serve your Lord." There's a temptation, especially in today's modern society, that we're blinded by luxury. We live in a world that has many more blessings than any generation before, and we live in a country that's blessed in many, many ways. Read with me, if you will, in Proverbs chapter 23, and let's look at verses 1 through 8. Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 8. And that passage says, "When you sit down to eat with a ruler, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you're a man given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. Do not overwork to be rich, because of your own understanding cease. Will you set your eyes on that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings, and they fly away like an eagle toward heaven. Do not eat the bread of a miser, nor desire his delicacies. For as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart's not with you. That morsel you have eaten, you will vomit up and waste your pleasant words." What he's saying here is be very careful about luxuries in life. There are certain times where we have a little bit of extra money in our pocket and we'll buy this or that or whatever else. But then in the future, perhaps some expense rises up and we have difficulty paying for that expense. There's some times where we're able to borrow from a bank or we're able to borrow from a friend, but we forget the years and years of payments that come with that luxury we just bought. And we forget the favors that are expected to be returned from that person we borrowed that money from. Don't be blinded by luxury. Also, Christians, as they work productively, must avoid the appearance of evil. Be careful as a businessman not to create an appearance of someone who is cutthroat, someone who has evil practices in mind, someone who is always trying to get the best of everybody else. In Matthew chapter 5, beginning of verse 13, Jesus telling us, he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but the salt loses its flavor. How is it seasoned? It's good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You're the light of the world, and you're the light of the world, and a city that's set up on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to everyone who is in the household. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, and they may glorify your Father who is in heaven." It's a very important concept of working in a way in which people see our Christianity and see the faith that we have. Lastly, I want us to notice that Christians work trustingly. That is, they submit themselves to God and they trust that He will take care of them. In James chapter 4, beginning of verse 13, James says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city and spend a year there and buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. We always have to realize that there's something greater and better in this world, and that is Jesus. And we have to realize our life is not guaranteed to the time we reach 65 or 67 in retirement. Our life is not guaranteed to the time in which our investments come back. That's why we've got to put God first in every decision that we make and trust in Him with all of our life. Also, Christians are trusting God in their work because they see their work is truly, in many ways, God's work. Psalm 27, beginning in verse 1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my strength and my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked came against me to eat up my flesh, my enemies and my foes, because of God, they stumbled and they failed." God blesses His children, and He will take care of us when we're active and when we're working for His glory. You see, Christians trust in God's care for them. 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 6, Jonathan, the son of King Saul, says to his armor bearer, "Come, let us go over to this garrison of these uncircumcised Philistines. It may be the Lord will work for us, but nothing restrains the Lord from saving, whether it be by many people or by few." What's Jonathan saying there? Jonathan is saying, listen, let's get to work. The army, Saul's army, was delaying, was afraid of fighting against the Philistines. And what we see here is Jonathan says, listen, let's get to work. God's going to see us through this. God's going to protect us. Let's go and do that work, which is right there. Very closely related to that, Psalm 37 and verse 25. The writer there says, "I've been young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous man forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread." God will take care of you. You need to be active. You need to be doing everything you can financially and physically for yourself. But realize, as a Christian, God and God's people will take care of us. That's our lesson that we're going to look at when we're talking about having a work ethic. It's important as Christians to see that God put us on this earth to be active. And it's important for us to realize the influence and example we have on so many people.